Sometimes evil thinks it can hide in the shadows of a forgotten town, preying on the innocent. Sometimes decent folks turn away when they should stand up. Four rough men cornered a young woman in Dry Creek, thinking nobody would care enough to stop them. They were wrong. Wade Sinclair, a wealthy cattle baron with a dark past, happened to ride into town that day. When he saw what they'd done to her, something cold and terrible woke up inside him. This wasn't just any cowboy, this was a man who'd earned his reputation the hard way. He didn't need to draw his gun or shout threats. One look from Wade Sinclair was enough to remind those thugs what real fear felt like. What did he do that left four hardened men frozen in their tracks? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust had barely settled from Wade Sinclair's arrival when the whispers began threading through Dry Creek like smoke from a dying fire. Old-timers who remembered the name Wade Sinclair felt their spines stiffen, while younger folks wondered why the mention of this white-suited stranger made grown men look over their shoulders. Wade stood 6 feet tall with shoulders that spoke of years wielding both rope and rifle. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and lines mapped the corners of his steel-gray eyes, lines earned through decades of squinting at horizons and reading the intentions of dangerous men. He wore a spotless white suit that somehow remained pristine despite the long ride, and his boots carried silver spurs that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. But it was the way he carried himself that marked him as different, the fluid grace of a man who'd walked through hellfire and emerged with his soul intact. The silver pocket watch tucked in his vest had belonged to his father, Thomas Sinclair, and bore an inscription that had guided Wade through his darkest years. Time reveals all truth. He'd pulled that watch from his pocket countless times during his transformation, from the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories to a man who built rather than destroyed. The weight of it against his chest served as both anchor and compass, reminding him of the promise he'd made at his father's graveside 15 years ago, to use his skills to protect rather than profit. Dr. Marcus Henderson had been tending wounds in Dry Creek for 23 years, and he'd seen his share of broken bones and broken spirits. A tall, lean man with gentle hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, Doc Henderson carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. His medical bag, worn smooth by decades of house calls, had delivered more babies than he could count and closed the eyes of just as many souls departing this world. When Wade dismounted in the front of Doc's office that afternoon, Henderson recognized something in the stranger's bearing, the careful control of a man holding tremendous force in check. The doctor had served as a field surgeon during the war and knew the look of someone who'd seen too much death. But there was something else in Wade's eyes, something that spoke of redemption rather than destruction. Sheriff Mills represented everything wrong with frontier justice. A thick-set man with greedy pig eyes and soft hands that had never known honest work, Mills wore his badge like a license to steal rather than serve. He'd bought his position through connections with powerful men in the territorial capital, and he ran Dry Creek like his personal kingdom. The law was whatever Mills said it was on any given day, and justice went to the highest bidder. Mills had grown comfortable with his corruption, surrounding himself with men who shared his flexible relationship with right and wrong. He took his cut from every illegal enterprise in town, the gambling, the watered whiskey, the protection money extorted from struggling merchants. The 4 men who'd attacked the young woman were his unofficial enforcers, keeping the decent folks too scared to challenge his authority. Martha Sullivan owned the Dusty Rose Saloon, but unlike most saloon keepers, she ran a respectable establishment where a man could get an honest drink and a fair game of cards. A woman in her 40s, with auburn hair, Streaked with premature grey and eyes that missed nothing, Martha had arrived in Dry Creek 5 years ago, with enough money to buy the saloon and enough backbone to run it on her terms. She'd quickly established herself as someone who'd tolerate no nonsense from rowdy customers, but she also became a quiet refuge for women with nowhere else to turn. Martha had her own reasons for understanding what it meant to be vulnerable in a lawless place, and she used her position to create an unofficial network of protection for those who needed it most. The 4 men who'd attacked the young woman represented the worst kind of frontier predators, men who took what they wanted because no one had ever made them pay the price. Jake Morrison, their leader, was a lean wolf of a man with dead eyes and quick hands. He'd been running with outlaws since his teens and had drifted into Dry Creek 2 years ago when things got too hot for him down in El Paso. Bull Garrett lived up to his name, a massive man with ham-sized fists and a brain that worked about as well as his conscience. He'd been kicked out of the army for brutality, which took some doing in those days, and had found his way to Morrison's side through a mutual love of violence. Tommy Kane was barely 20, but already carried the soul of a much older killer. Silas Reed rounded out the group, a scarred man with a talent for cruelty and a complete absence of mercy. These 4 had terrorized Dry Creek for months, taking what they wanted from whoever they pleased while Sheriff Mills looked the other way. They'd grown bold in their impunity, believing themselves untouchable as long as they kicked back a portion of their theft to Mills and his corrupt deputies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street when Wade first encountered the aftermath of their latest cruelty. The young woman they'd attacked lay crumpled against the wooden steps of Martha's saloon, her blue dress torn and stained with blood and dirt. In her clenched fist, she clutched a torn blue ribbon, all that remained of the simple hair tie she'd worn that morning when the world still made sense. Wade knelt beside her with the careful movements of a man who understood trauma, his voice gentle as morning rain. "Easy now, miss. You're safe. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The woman, Sarah Collins, as he would soon learn, looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much horror for someone so young. She was perhaps 22, with honey-colored hair and features that spoke of gentleness and kindness. The kind of woman who'd spend her last penny helping a neighbor, which made the cruelty visited upon her all the more heinous. Sarah had come to Dry Creek 6 months ago after losing her parents to fever, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and her mother's sewing basket. She'd found work as a seamstress, living in a tiny room above the general store and sending half her meager earnings to support an elderly aunt back in Kansas. She attended church every Sunday, helped Martha serve meals to hungry drifters, and had never spoken an unkind word about anyone. Her only crime had been walking alone to the post office that morning, and her only misfortune had been catching the attention of Jake Morrison and his crew. They'd cornered her in the alley beside the bank, and when she'd screamed for help, the few people who heard had hurried in the opposite direction. As Wade helped Sarah to her feet, something awakened in his chest, the same cold fire that had once made him the most feared gunslinger from Abilene to El Paso. But this was different from the rage that had driven him in his younger days. This was righteous anger, tempered by years of hard-won wisdom and focused by the moral code he'd spent 15 years building. He'd put away his guns after the killing of Billy Torino in Tombstone, when he'd looked down at another young man's body and realized that each death was carving away another piece of his soul. The silver pocket watch had been his father's final gift, and Thomas Sinclair had been a good man, a rancher who'd built something lasting instead of leaving a trail of graves. Wade had spent the past 15 years doing the same, building a cattle empire that stretched across 3 counties and employed hundreds of good men who'd found second chances under his banner. His Circle S ranch had become a refuge for veterans, drifters, and anyone willing to work hard for honest wages. He'd thought his fighting days were behind him, but looking at Sarah's battered face and the torn blue ribbon in her trembling hand, Wade felt the familiar weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Some fights couldn't be walked away from, and some evil demanded a response that went beyond words and good intentions. The four men who'd hurt this young woman had made a fundamental error. They'd assumed that in a place like Dry Creek, no one would care enough to stand up for an orphan seamstress with no family and no power. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and amber, Wade Sinclair checked his father's silver watch and made a promise that would change Dry Creek forever. Time, as his father had always said, revealed all truth. And the truth was that some men needed to be reminded that actions carried consequences, even in the most forgotten corners of the frontier. The torn blue ribbon fluttered in Sarah's hand like a flag of surrender, but Wade saw it differently. To him, it was a declaration of war against the kind of men who preyed on the innocent, and he was exactly the kind of man equipped to deliver that message with crystal clarity. The reckoning was about to begin. The blood-stained handkerchief in Sarah Collins' trembling hand bore the initials R.C. her father's handkerchief, embroidered by her mother's careful fingers during happier times. Robert Collins had been a good man who'd raised his daughter to believe in kindness and trust, virtues that seemed cruelly naive in the harsh reality of Dry Creek's dusty streets. Wade knelt beside Sarah on the saloon porch, his voice gentle as he helped her sit up against the weathered wooden post. "Take your time, miss. Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah's voice came in whispers, broken by tremors that shook her entire frame. "I was walking to the post office to mail a letter to my aunt in Kansas. It was just past 10 this morning, and the street was quiet. Too quiet, I should have realized." Her fingers clutched the blood-stained handkerchief like a lifeline. 4 men came out of the alley beside the bank. They'd been drinking. I could smell it on them. Doc Henderson appeared with his medical bag, his practiced eyes immediately assessing Sarah's injuries. A cut lip, bruises forming on her arms, and the kind of shocked expression that spoke of trauma beyond the physical. He worked quietly while Sarah continued her account, his gentle hands cleaning wounds while his ears listened to a story that made his jaw tighten with controlled anger. The big one, they called him Bull. He grabbed my arm first, said I was too pretty to be walking alone, that a girl like me needed protection. Sarah's voice cracked. When I tried to pull away, the leader Jake, the men, others called him Jake. He laughed and said they'd be happy to show me what protection looked like. Wade's steel-grey eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face, but his hands had begun to move with subtle precision, checking the placement of his gun and the position of his knife. These were unconscious movements, muscle memory from decades of violent encounters, awakening despite 15 years of peaceful living. "I screamed for help," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as Doc Henderson's ministrations eased her physical discomfort. "I saw Mrs. Peterson across the street and old Mr. Williams coming out of the general store. But when they heard me scream, they just looked away and hurried off in the other direction, like I wasn't even there." Martha Sullivan emerged from her saloon, having heard the commotion. She took one look at Sarah's condition, and her face hardened into an expression of pure fury. Martha had seen this kind of thing before, in other frontier towns, where men like Morrison's crew operated with impunity. "Those 4 animals have been terrorizing this town for months," Martha said, her voice carrying the steel of hard-earned experience. "Sheriff Mills won't touch them because they're on his payroll. Every decent person in Dry Creek walks in fear while those monsters take whatever they want." Wade stood slowly, his movements controlled but purposeful. "Tell me about these men. I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and a desperate kind of hope. "Jake Morrison is their leader. Tall, thin, with pale eyes that look right through you like you're nothing. Bull Garrett is the big one, massive shoulders, no neck, hands like ham hocks. Tommy Kane can't be more than 20, but he's got the coldest smile I've ever seen. And Silas Reed, he's got scars across his face and talks real soft, which somehow makes him scarier than the others." Martha nodded grimly. "They showed up about 8 months ago, just drifted into town like buzzards following a wagon. Train started small, demanding free drinks, intimidating merchants, roughing up anyone who looked at them wrong. But Sheriff Mills saw an opportunity to expand his little empire of corruption, so he made them his unofficial deputies." "Where are they now?" Wade asked, his voice carrying undertones that made both women look at him more carefully. "Probably at the Silver Dollar, the gambling hall across from the bank," Martha replied. "They usually hole up there after they've had their fun, drinking away whatever money they've stolen and planning their next bit of mischief." Wade pulled out his father's silver pocket watch and checked the time. 3:30 in the afternoon. The inscription, "Time reveals all truth," seemed particularly relevant as he contemplated the reckoning that was about to unfold. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice formal but kind, "I want you to know that what happened to you today is not your fault, and it will not go unpunished. There are men in this world who mistake kindness for weakness, but they're about to learn the difference." Sarah struggled to her feet with Doc Henderson's help, her legs still unsteady from shock. "Who are you?" she asked, studying Wade's face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You talk like you know how to handle men like them." Wade was quiet for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the dusty street. "I used to be someone different," he said finally. "Someone I spent 15 years trying to forget. But sometimes the past has a way of calling us back when good people need protection." Doc Henderson finished cleaning Sarah's wounds and prescribed rest, but his attention was focused on Wade. As a former field surgeon, he'd learned to read men quickly, and what he saw in Wade Sinclair's bearing troubled him. "Son, whatever you're thinking about doing, remember that violence has a way of breeding more violence." "Sometimes, Doc, violence is the only language that certain people understand," Wade replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I've tried peaceful solutions to difficult problems, and most of the time they work. But there are wolves in this world who see mercy as weakness, and the only way to stop a wolf is to show him a bigger predator." As if summoned by the conversation, the 4 men who'd attacked Sarah came swaggering out of the Silver Dollar gambling hall. Jake Morrison led the group, his pale eyes scanning the street with the lazy confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Bull Garrett followed, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to darken the entire street. Tommy Kane and Silas Reed flanked them, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. They moved with the swagger of men who owned the town, their laughter carrying across the street like the sound of breaking glass. Morrison spotted the group gathered around Sarah, and his lips curved into a cruel smile. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the practiced mockery of a man who enjoyed causing fear. "Looks like our little songbird found herself some company. Hope you folks enjoyed the show earlier, we sure did." Wade stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the approaching men. His movements were fluid and precise, and something in his bearing made Morrison's group slow their approach. This wasn't the reaction they were used to receiving from the decent folks of Dry Creek. "Gentlemen," Wade said, his voice carrying across the dusty street with quiet authority, "I believe you owe this young lady an apology." Morrison's laughter was like the sound of spitting into a fire. "An apology? For what? Having a conversation with a pretty girl? Last I checked, talking wasn't against the law in Dry Creek. Neither is getting your teeth knocked down your throat," Wade replied, his voice remaining perfectly level. "But that doesn't make it advisable." The 4 men spread out slightly, a movement so subtle that most observers wouldn't have noticed it, but Wade caught the tactical positioning immediately. They were preparing for a fight. Bull Garrett cracked, his knuckles, a sound like breaking branches. Tommy Kane's hand drifted closer to his gun. Silas Reed's scarred face split into a grin that held no warmth whatsoever. But it was Morrison who held Wade's attention. The man's pale eyes held the flat emptiness of someone who'd killed before and would kill again without a moment's hesitation. This wasn't going to end with words. "You know what I think," Morrison said, taking another step forward. "I think you should mind your own business, old man, before you bite off more than you can chew." Wade checked his father's pocket watch. One more. Time, the silver surface catching the late afternoon sun. Time reveals all truth, and the truth was that some men could only be stopped through superior force. He'd hoped his fighting days were behind him, but sometimes hope had to give way to necessity. "The thing is," Wade said, closing the Bundes, watch with a soft click, "I've already made this my business." The torn blue ribbon in Sarah's hand fluttered in the wind, and Wade knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether Dry Creek remained a place where evil thrived or became somewhere decent people could live. Without fear, Sarah's mother's Bible rested on the small table beside her bed in the room above the general store, its worn leather cover marked by years of faithful reading. Pressed flowers served as bookmarks throughout the pages, wildflowers that Sarah and her mother had collected during Sunday walks back in Kansas, when the world seemed gentler and faith felt like armor against life's cruelties. Wade had insisted that Doc Henderson examine Sarah thoroughly, and while the doctor worked, Wade began his own investigation into the pattern of violence that had plagued Dry Creek. What he discovered made his blood run cold and his resolve harden like tempered steel. Mrs. Elena Martinez, a widow who ran the town's small bakery, had been the first to speak up after word spread that someone was finally willing to listen. She approached Wade the following morning as he sat on the porch of the boarding house, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "Senor Sinclair," she whispered, glancing around nervously to make sure no one was watching. "Those men, they came to my bakery 3 weeks ago. They took bread, took money, and when I protested, Bull Garrett grabbed my wrist so hard he left bruises that lasted for days." Wade listened intently, his steel-grey eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Did you report it to Sheriff Mills?" Elena's bitter laugh held no humor. "I tried. Mills told me that boys will be boys, and maybe I should be more grateful for their protection. Said maybe I needed to contribute more to the town's safety fund if I wanted better service." As the morning progressed, more stories emerged. Thomas Brennan, who owned the feed store, admitted that Morrison's crew had been taking supplies without payment for months. Jenny Walsh, barely 18 and working as a waitress in the cafe, revealed that Tommy Kane had cornered her behind the restaurant 2 weeks ago, only backing off when Martha Sullivan appeared with a loaded shotgun. Each story painted a clearer picture of systematic intimidation designed to keep the town under Sheriff Mills' corrupt control. The 4 men weren't just random predators, they were the enforcement arm of a protection racket that had turned Dry Creek into Mills' personal kingdom. Wade's investigation led him to the sheriff's office, a squat adobe building that squatted on Main Street like a cancer on the town's landscape. Mills sat behind a desk that had seen better days, his soft hands folded over his considerable belly as he regarded Wade with the calculating gaze of a man weighing risks against profits. "I hear you've been asking questions around town," Mills said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Might be you're getting the wrong impression about how things work in Dry Creek." Wade settled into the chair across from Mills' desk with the easy grace of a man comfortable in dangerous situations. "Enlighten me, Sheriff. How exactly do things work in your town?" Mills leaned forward, his pig eyes glittering with greed and cunning. "See, we got ourselves a delicate balance here. Good folks go about their business, pay their taxes and their protection fees, and they don't have to worry about the rougher elements that drift through these parts. My boys, Jake and his crew, they keep the real troublemakers moving along." "Protection fees?" Wade's voice remained perfectly level, but something in his tone made Mills shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Well now, that's just good business sense," Mills blustered. A man's got to eat, and keeping the peace ain't free. The town council voted to impose a special assessment for enhanced security services. Wade checked his father's silver pocket watch, the familiar weight of it grounding him in his moral certainty. Funny thing about that. Assessment, Sheriff. I spoke with Mayor Hendricks this morning, and he seems to think the town council never voted on any such thing. Mill's face flushed red, but before he could respond, the door opened, and Jake Morrison sauntered in with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been truly challenged. He took one look at Wade, and his hand drifted toward his gun. Well, Morrison drawled, if it isn't our new friend who likes to stick his nose where it don't belong. Sheriff, you want me to escort this troublemaker out of town? Wade stood slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. At 53, he moved like a man 20 years younger, and there was something in his bearing that made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. Actually, Wade said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, I was just leaving. But Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for making my decision so much easier. What decision? Morrison asked, his pale eyes narrowing with suspicion. Wade smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just the cold promise of reckoning. The decision about whether to handle this situation with words or with more direct methods. You've convinced me that some problems require a more hands-on approach. As Wade walked toward the door, Morrison's hand dropped to his gun butt. You threatening me, old man? Wade paused in the doorway, his profile etched against the bright afternoon sunlight. Son, when I threaten you, you'll know it. What I'm doing right now is making you a promise. Miss Collins is under my protection now, and anyone who troubles her or any other innocent person in this town will answer to me personally. Morrison's laughter followed Wade out into the street, but there was an edge of nervousness in it that hadn't been there before. Word was spreading through Dry Creek that Wade Sinclair wasn't just another drifter passing through, he was someone with the means and the will to back up his words with action. Martha Sullivan had been watching from her saloon's front window, and she intercepted Wade as he walked back toward the boarding house. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight as she fell into step beside him. You're playing a dangerous game, she said quietly. Mills and his boys don't respond well to challenges to their authority. Wade glanced at her. Appraisingly, Martha Sullivan struck him as a woman who'd faced her share of dangerous men and survived to tell about it. Sometimes dangerous games are the only ones worth playing, he replied. You don't understand, Martha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. There's more going on here than just corruption. Mills has connections, powerful men who profit from keeping places like Dry Creek lawless. You start a fight here, you might be taking on more than you bargained for. Wade stopped walking and turned to face her directly. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but some fights choose you whether you want them or not. That young woman didn't deserve what happened to her, and if good people don't stand up to evil, then evil wins by default. Martha studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her nod slowly. In that case, she said, you should know that you're not alone in this. There are folks in this town who've been waiting for someone with the backbone to make a stand. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Wade felt the familiar weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. He'd tried to put his violent past behind him, but sometimes the past had a way of catching up with a man whether he wanted it to or not. The worn Bible in Sarah's room seemed to whisper of faith and perseverance, but Wade knew that sometimes faith needed to be backed up with steel and powder. Some evils required more than prayers to stop them. The wanted poster tucked in the bottom drawer of Sheriff Mills's desk bore the faded image of a younger man with the same steel-gray eyes as Wade Sinclair. Wanted. Wade, the Raven Sinclair, $500 reward for the killing of Billy Torino and 6 others in Tombstone. Extremely dangerous. The poster was 15 years old, but Mills had kept it as insurance against the day when such information might prove valuable. That night, after Wade's confrontation at the sheriff's office, Morrison's crew decided to send a message that would demonstrate the cost of interfering with their operations. They chose their target carefully, not Wade himself, who had proven to be more formidable than expected, but the vulnerable young woman whose assault had started this entire conflict. Sarah was awakened from fitful sleep by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a rock through her window, and tied to it was a note written in crude block letters. "Keep your mouth shut or next time will be worse." The message was signed with a crude drawing of a Raven Morrison's idea of psychological warfare. But Morrison had made a critical error. He'd underestimated both Sarah's courage and Wade's protective instincts. When Sarah brought the note to Wade the following morning, her hands were steady and her voice was clear. "They think they can scare me into silence," she said, her chin raised with defiance that would have made her parents proud. "But I won't. Let them win. My father always said that standing up to bullies was the only way to stop them." Wade studied the note, paying particular attention to the raven symbol. It seemed Morrison had done some research of his own, digging into Wade's past and trying to turn it into a weapon. But knowledge could be a double-edged sword, and Morrison was about to learn that some legends were better left undisturbed. Doc Henderson joined them for breakfast at Martha's saloon, his medical bag never far from his side. As the town's physician, he'd treated enough victims of Morrison's violence to understand the stakes involved. But he'd also seen enough violence in his life to worry about what Wade's involvement might unleash. "Son," Doc said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate care, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about showing wolves a bigger predator. But sometimes when you stir up a nest of rattlesnakes, innocent people get bit." Wade appreciated the doctor's concern, but his resolve had only hardened overnight. "Doc, those rattlesnakes have been biting innocent people for months. The only difference now is that someone's finally willing to bite back." Martha approached their table, moving with the cautious grace of someone who'd learned to read the mood of a room before entering it. She carried a pot of fresh coffee and wore an expression that suggested she had important information to share. "You need to know something," she said. Glancing around to make sure no one else was listening, word came in on the morning stage. Morrison sent a telegram yesterday, and the reply came back this morning. "They're bringing in help." Wade's steel-grey eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of help?" "The Garrett brothers." "Martha," replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Bull's got 2 older brothers who've been running with a gang up in Colorado. They're coming to Dry Creek, and they're bringing friends." Doc Henderson set down his coffee cup with a slight rattle. "How many friends?" "The telegrapher, and don't ask. How I know this, he saw the message before Mills got to it. 6 men arriving on tomorrow's noon stage. Professional gunmen, by all accounts." Wade pulled out his father's silver pocket watch and checked the time, the familiar ritual helping him think through the tactical situation. The inscription, "Time reveals all truth," seemed particularly relevant as he contemplated the escalating conflict. "They're trying to overwhelm me with numbers," he said, more to himself than to his companions. "Standard outlaw tactic. If you can't win through skill, win through superior firepower." Sarah leaned forward, her honey-colored hair catching the morning light streaming through the saloon's windows. "What does this mean for the town? For all the innocent people who live here?" Wade met her gaze directly, seeing both fear and determination in her blue eyes. "It means that Morrison and his crew have just escalated this from a local problem to something much bigger. But it also means they're scared enough to call for help, which tells me they're not as confident as they pretend to be." Throughout the morning, as word spread about the incoming reinforcements, the town's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Shopkeepers began boarding up their windows. Families with young children started making plans to visit relatives in neighboring towns. The decent folks of Dry Creek recognized the signs of impending violence and prepared accordingly. But not everyone was preparing to run. Wade was quietly surprised to discover that Martha's underground network was larger and more organized than he'd initially realized. Men who'd served in the war, ranch hands who knew how to use rifles, even a few women who'd learned to shoot during Indian raids, they began approaching Wade with quiet offers of support. Tom Brennan, despite his earlier fears, closed his feed store early and sought out Wade at the boarding house. "I fought at Gettysburg," the middle-aged shopkeeper said, his hands shaking slightly but his voice steady. "Lost my left arm to Confederate. Grape shot, but I can still shoot straight with my right. If you're making a stand, I want to be part of it." Similar conversations occurred throughout the day. Wade found himself reluctantly impressed by the courage of people who'd been living in fear for months, but were now willing to risk everything for the chance at freedom from Morrison's reign of terror. As evening approached, Wade sat alone on the boarding house porch, cleaning and checking his weapons for the first time in 15 years. The familiar rituals brought back memories he'd tried to bury: the weight of a Colt .45 in his hand, the precise movements of loading cartridges, the cold certainty that came with preparing for violence. Sarah found him there as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. She carried a cup of coffee and wore an expression of quiet determination that reminded Wade of her mother's Bible and the faith it represented. "You don't have to do this," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "No one would blame you if you just rode away." Wade looked at her, seeing not just the victim of Morrison's cruelty, but a woman of genuine strength and courage. "Some things are worth fighting for," he replied. "Decent people shouldn't have to live in fear just because evil men think they can take whatever they want." The wanted poster in Mill's desk drawer might reveal Wade's violent past, but time had indeed revealed a greater truth: that a man could change, could find redemption, and could use his dark gifts in service of something larger than himself. The reckoning was coming, and Wade Sinclair was ready for it. The cattle brand iron bearing the Circle S mark lay twisted and blackened in the ashes of Wade's burned barn, a symbol of everything he'd built being reduced to smoke and memory. The attack had come at dawn, when most decent folks were still abed, and the world was painted in shades of grey and gold. Morrison's crew had struck fast and hard, torching the barn and running off 30 head of prime cattle before, disappearing into the maze of arroyos that carved the landscape around Dry Creek. Wade stood among the smoking ruins, his white suit somehow still immaculate despite the chaos surrounding him. His ranch, Han's 5 men who'd followed him through hell and back during their army days, moved through the wreckage with the practiced efficiency of soldiers assessing battle damage. "Could have been worse, boss," said Ezra Thompson, Wade's foreman and oldest friend. A lean, weathered man with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much war, Ezra carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who'd survived Shiloh and Antietam. They were sending a message, not trying to destroy everything. If they'd wanted real damage, they'd have hit the house and the main corral. Wade nodded, understanding the tactical psychology behind the attack. Morrison was trying to demonstrate his reach while offering an implicit bargain: back down now and suffer only minor losses, or escalate further and risk losing everything. "Round up the boys," Wade said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. It's time they understood what they're really fighting for. The 5 men who gathered in Wade's parlor that evening represented the core of his transformation from gunfighter to rancher. They'd all served under him during the war, following their young lieutenant through some of the bloodiest campaigns in Tennessee and Georgia. When the war ended, they drifted until Wade found them and offered them something better than saloon fights and cattle rustling: honest work, building something that would last. Ezra Thompson had been Wade's sergeant, a man who could read terrain like scripture and shoot the eye out of a playing card at 50 paces. Miguel Santos had joined them after Chickamauga, a former vaquero whose skill with horses was matched only by his loyalty to the men who'd accepted him as family. James Bear Morrison, no relation to Jake, despite the shared surname, was a mountain of a man whose gentle nature disguised his devastating effectiveness in close combat. Rounding out the group were the twins, Luke and Mark Patterson, who'd grown up on neighboring farms in Ohio and enlisted together on their 18th birthday. They'd survived 4 years of war without a scratch, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate each other's movements in combat. Now they ran Wade's horse operation with the same seamless coordination they'd once brought to cavalry charges. "You all know why we're here," Wade began, settling into his father's old leather chair with the silver pocket watch. Resting on the side table, what happened to Miss Collins could happen to any decent woman in this territory. What happened to our barn could happen to any man who dares to stand up for what's right. Bear Morrison spoke up, his deep voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "We signed on to punch cattle and break horses, boss, but some of us have been waiting 15 years for you to remember who you really are." Wade studied the faces of these men who'd followed him through hell and chose to stay when peace offered them a different path. "I need you to understand what you're volunteering for. Jake Morrison isn't just another outlaw, he's connected to something bigger. The men coming in on tomorrow's stage are professionals, and this fight is going to get bloody before it's over." Miguel Santos leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Patron, you pulled me out of a federale jail in Juarez when I had nowhere else to turn. You gave me work, respect, family. If you're making a stand against men like these, then my gun is yours." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications before Luke spoke for both of them. "We've been watching what those animals do to the decent folks in town. Sarah Collins reminds us of our sister back in Ohio, sweet, trusting, deserving of protection. We're in, boss, whatever it takes." Wade felt something tighten in his chest as he looked at these men who'd chosen to stand with him, despite understanding the risks. This was what he'd been fighting for without realizing it, not just justice for Sarah, but the preservation of everything good and decent that civilization could offer. A soft knock at the door interrupted the gathering, and Doc Henderson entered, carrying his medical bag and wearing an expression of grave concern. "Wade, I need to speak with you about what I found when I examined Sarah more thoroughly." The doctor's words carried an ominous weight that made everyone in the room stiffen. Wade gestured for him to continue. "The injuries were worse than I initially thought," Doc said carefully. "There's evidence of systematic brutality. This wasn't random violence or even ordinary assault. Someone took their time, enjoyed causing pain. Sarah's strong, and she's healing physically, but the psychological damage runs deep." Wade's hands clenched into fists, and for the moment the mask of civilized restraint slipped to reveal the cold fury that had once made him the most feared gunfighter in 3 territories. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Doc?" Henderson nodded gravely. "I'm saying that what they did to her was calculated cruelty, designed to break her spirit as well as her body. Men who do such things don't stop unless they're made to stop permanently." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of night wind through the damaged barn. Wade pulled out his father's pocket watch and opened it, staring at the inscription that had guided him through 15 years of peaceful living. "Time reveals all truth," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "And the truth is that some evils can't be reasoned with, negotiated with, or reformed. Some cancers have to be cut out, completely." Ezra Thompson spoke into the silence. "What are your orders, Lieutenant?" The use of his old military rank brought Wade fully back into the mindset he'd tried to abandon. These weren't ranch hands anymore, they were soldiers preparing for war. The branded iron might be destroyed, but what it represented, the idea that good men could build something lasting through honest work that was worth any sacrifice. "Tomorrow at noon, 6 professional killers arrive on the stage, Wade said, his voice carrying the same authority that had once rallied troops under fire. By sundown tomorrow, this ends one way or another. We're not just fighting for Sarah Collins, or even for Dry Creek. We're fighting for the idea that decent people shouldn't have to live in fear. As his men filed out to make their preparations, Wade remained alone with his thoughts and his father's. Watch. The transformation was complete. Wade, the Raven Sinclair, was riding again, but this time in service of something greater than his own legend. Sarah's mother's wedding ring hung on a delicate silver chain around her neck, a simple band of gold that caught the morning light as she sat by her window. The ring represented everything she'd lost: loving parents, a secure home, the belief that goodness would always triumph over evil, but also everything she hoped to find again. As she watched Wade and his men prepare for the inevitable confrontation, she felt something stirring in her heart that she'd thought the attack had killed forever. The transformation in Sarah over the past week had been remarkable to witness. The broken, traumatized young woman who'd clutched a torn blue ribbon was evolving into someone stronger, forged by suffering, but not destroyed by it. She'd begun helping Martha at the saloon, serving meals to the growing number of townspeople who'd quietly allied themselves with Wade's cause. Wade found her there as the noon stage approached, carrying coffee and determination in equal measure. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow shadows, but the steel in her blue eyes burned brighter than ever. "You should leave town," he said gently, settling beside her at the small corner table where she'd taken her break. "Take the evening stage to Denver and stay with your aunt until this is over." Sarah's laugh held no bitterness, only a quiet strength that reminded Wade of his mother's unwavering faith. "Mr. Sinclair, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about how decent people shouldn't have to live in fear. Well, if I run now, I'll be living in fear for the rest of my life." Doc Henderson approached their table, his medical bag in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The past week had aged the gentle physician, worry lines carving deeper around his kind eyes as he contemplated the violence that was about to engulf his quiet town. "Sarah's right to stay," he said, settling into the third chair with a tired sigh. "I've seen what happens to people who let trauma drive them into hiding. Sometimes the only way to heal is to face down the source of the wound." Through the saloon's front window, they could see Jake Morrison and his 3 companions lounging outside the Silver Dollar gambling hall. Bull Garrett was cleaning his fingernails with a wicked-looking knife, while Tommy Kane practiced quick draws with an empty holster. Silas Reed simply sat and watched the street with the patient intensity of a predator waiting for prey. But it was Morrison himself who commanded attention. The lean, outlaw leader had shed his usual casual demeanor in favor of something more calculating. He wore his guns low and tied down, and his pale eyes swept the street with the methodical precision of someone planning a battlefield. "They're different today," Martha observed, joining the conversation as she refilled coffee cups. "Focused, like they've stopped playing games and started thinking of this as war." Wade nodded, recognizing the shift in his opponent's demeanor. Professional killers bring professional discipline. Morrison knows that 6 more guns gives him overwhelming superiority, so he's willing to bet everything on a direct confrontation. As if summoned by the conversation, the distant sound of the noon stage reached their ears. The rhythmic pounding of hooves and the rattle of wheels on the dusty road announced the arrival of Morrison's reinforcements and the end of any possibility for peaceful resolution. Wade pulled out his father's silver pocket watch and checked the time. 12:15. The stage was running late, which might work in his favor. Every extra minute gave his own people more time to prepare, and Morrison's crew more time to grow nervous. "I want you all to understand something," Wade said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded troops under fire. "What's about to happen isn't just about justice for Sarah, or even about cleaning up Dry Creek. This is about proving that evil doesn't get to win just because it's willing to use violence. The stage appeared at the far end of Main Street, a cloud of dust marking its approach like smoke from a funeral pyre. Wade could make out 6 additional figures riding alongside the coach, their silhouettes unmistakably those of men accustomed to violence. The Garrett brothers had indeed brought friends, and from their bearing, these weren't common saddle tramps, but experienced gunfighters. Sarah reached across the table and touched Wade's hand, her fingers warm despite the chill of impending confrontation. "Promise me something," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "Anything," Wade replied, meaning it. "Promise me you'll remember who you are now, not just who you used to be. You're not just the Raven anymore. You're the man who built something good, who gave broken soldiers a second chance, who showed a traumatized woman that there are still decent men in this world." Wade felt something shift in his chest as her words sank home. For 15 years, he'd been running from his violent past, afraid that embracing it even for righteous purposes would drag him back into the darkness he'd fought so hard to escape. But Sarah was right, he wasn't the same man who'd killed Billy Torino in Tombstone. Time had indeed revealed the truth, and the truth was that he'd become something better. Doc Henderson stood as the stage pulled up in front of the hotel, his professional instincts already preparing for the casualties that were sure to follow. "I'll be at my office," he said simply. "When this is over, bring me whoever needs patching up." Martha moved behind the bar, her hands checking the position of the shotgun she kept hidden beneath the polished wood. "My customers know to hit the floor when the potions shooting starts," she said with grim practicality. "But if any of those animals try to hurt innocent people, they'll discover that I know how to use this scattergun." As the 6 reinforcements dismounted from their travel-stained horses, Wade got his first clear look at the men Morrison had summoned to end this conflict. They were everything he'd expected: hard-faced professionals who wore their guns like tools of their trade and moved with the fluid confidence of men who'd survived countless violent encounters. But they were also making the same mistake that Morrison had made. From the beginning, they were seeing Wade Sinclair as just another aging gunfighter trying to relive past glories. They had no idea they were facing a man who'd spent 15 years learning to channel his deadly skills through the lens of hard-won wisdom and moral certainty. The wedding ring on. Sarah's chain caught the afternoon light as she stood to return to her work, and Wade found himself thinking about the future that might exist beyond the next few hours. A future where decent people could build families and communities without fear, where young women like Sarah could walk to the post office without terror, where the rule of law meant something more than the whims of corrupt men. It was a future worth fighting for, worth killing for, and if necessary, worth dying for. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Wade Sinclair was ready to show Jake Morrison and his reinforcements what happened when evil pushed a good man too far. The forged land deed that Doc Henderson discovered hidden in Sheriff Mills' safe bore the official seal of the Territorial Land Office and the signature of Edgar Thorne, president of the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company. Sarah's family farm, the modest plot of land her parents had left her, sat directly in the path of the proposed rail line that would connect Denver to the California coast, making it worth more than 100 ordinary homesteads. Doc had found the document by accident while treating Mills for a bout of severe stomach pain that had left the corrupt sheriff doubled over and barely conscious. In his delirium, Mills had babbled the combination to his safe, and Henderson's medical ethics had warred briefly with his civic duty before duty won. What he discovered changed everything they thought they knew about the violence plaguing Dry Creek. Wade studied the forged deed by lamplight in Doc's office, his steel-gray eyes tracing the careful forgery that would have transferred Sarah's property to Edgar Thorne for a fraction of its true value. The document was dated 3 days before the attack. On Sarah, meaning her assault hadn't been random brutality, but calculated terrorism designed to drive her from her land. "Edgar Thorne," Wade said quietly, the name carrying the weight of old wounds and bitter memories. I should have known he was behind this. Sarah looked up from the chair, where she'd been sitting in stunned silence since learning that her parents' legacy had been the true target all along. "You know this man?" Wade's laugh held no humor, only the harsh recognition of old enemies and older mistakes. "I know him. 15 years ago, Edgar Thorne and I were partners in a mining venture up in Colorado. He handled the business end while I provided security for the operation. Good money, legitimate work, or so I thought." Doc Henderson poured 3 glasses of whiskey with hands that trembled slightly from the implications of what they'd discovered. "What happened? Thorne was using our mining operation as a front for claim jumping and land fraud. When honest prospectors struck gold on neighboring claims, Thorne would send in hired guns to run them off, then file legal papers claiming the land had been abandoned. My job was supposed to be protecting our workers, but Thorne was using my reputation to intimidate anyone who might ask questions about his methods." Wade accepted the glass of whiskey but didn't drink, his attention focused on the painful memories that the forged deed had awakened. "When I found out what he was really doing, I confronted him. Told him I wanted out of the partnership and that he needed to make things right with the people he'd cheated. Thorne's response was to hire a gunman named Billy Torino to kill me and make it look like a mining accident." Sarah's blue eyes widened with understanding. "Billy Torino, the man on that wanted poster. The one you killed in Tombstone. The one I had to kill," Wade corrected, his voice carrying the weight of necessity rather than pride. "Torino was fast and he was ruthless, but he made the mistake of bragging about his contract in a Tombstone saloon. Word got back to me, and I decided to face him directly rather than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. The confrontation in Tombstone had been Wade's last gunfight, the moment when he'd looked down at Billy Torino's body and realized that each man he killed was carving away another piece of his soul. He'd walked away from Edgar Thorne's blood money and started the long journey toward redemption that had led him to cattle ranching and 15 years of peaceful living. But Thorne survived," Doc Henderson observed, understanding the implications immediately. "Thorne survived, and apparently he's learned to be more subtle in his methods," Wade replied grimly. "Instead of hiring obvious gunfighters, he's found men like Morrison who can pose as common outlaws while doing Thorne's dirty work. The railroad needs a clear path through this valley, and Sarah's farm is the key piece of property." Sarah stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street where Morrison and his reinforcements were undoubtedly planning their final assault. "So my parents' death, my attack, all the terror this town has endured. It's all been about money and a terror. Railroad tracks?" Wade felt the familiar cold fury building in his chest, but this time it was tempered by the wisdom of years and focused by moral certainty. "It's about more than that, Sarah. It's about the kind of men who see other people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings, deserving of respect and protection." The sound of approaching boots on the wooden sidewalk interrupted their conversation, and all 3 tensed as heavy footsteps stopped outside Doc's office. A moment later, Jake Morrison's voice called through the door with mock civility. "Doc Henderson, I know you're in there with our friend Mr. Sinclair. Mind if we come in for a chat?" Wade's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he forced himself to remain calm. Morrison wasn't ready for a direct confrontation, yet this was still part of the psychological warfare that had preceded every major gunfight Wade had ever survived. "What do you want, Morrison?" Wade called back. "Just thought you might be interested to know that the boss wants to meet with you. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at the old church on the hill. Come alone, and maybe we can work out a deal that saves everyone. A lot of unnecessary bloodshed." Doc Henderson started to respond, but Wade silenced him with a gesture. This was exactly what he'd been expecting. Thorne was too much of a businessman to risk everything on a gunfight when negotiation might accomplish his goals more efficiently. "I'll be there," Wade replied. But if any harm comes to Miss Collins or anyone else in this town between now and then, the deal is off, and you'll answer to me personally." Morrison's laughter echoed through the door. "Fair enough, Sinclair, but you might want to bring your reading glasses. The boss has some very interesting documents he'd like to show you." As the footsteps retreated down the street, Sarah turned from the window with an expression of fierce determination. "It's a trap. You know that, don't you?" Wade nodded, already beginning to formulate a plan that would turn Thorne's trap into the railroad baron's downfall. "Of course it's a trap, but sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk into it with your eyes open and a better trap of your own." Doc Henderson studied the forged deed again, his physician's mind working through the legal implications. "If we can prove this document is fraudulent, and if we can connect it to the violence against Sarah and the other victims, we might be able to bring in federal marshals. Railroad fraud is a federal crime." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Wade said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd found his purpose again. "But first, Edgar Thorne is going to get the reunion he's been asking for since Tombstone. Time to remind him why our partnership ended the way it did." The forged land deed represented more than attempted theft. It was proof that evil men would always find new ways to prey upon the innocent, and that sometimes the only response was superior force applied with righteous purpose. Tomorrow morning's meeting would determine whether justice or corruption ruled in Dry Creek, and Wade Sinclair was ready to settle that question permanently. But first, he had one more night to prepare for a confrontation that had been 15 years in the making, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. The decent people of Dry Creek deserved better than to be pawns in Edgar Thorne's game of greed, and Wade intended to make sure they got it. Wade's old black leather shooting glove lay on the dresser in his room at the boarding house, its supple surface worn smooth by years of practice, draws, and deadly encounters. He hadn't worn it in 15 years, but muscle memory guided his fingers as he pulled it on, the familiar weight and grip transforming his hand from that of a peaceful rancher into the tool of a legendary gunfighter. The glove represented his full acceptance of what tomorrow would require, not the desperate violence of his youth, but the controlled application of deadly force in service of justice. Wade flexed his fingers, feeling the leather conform to his hand like a second skin, and knew that he was ready for whatever Edgar Thorne had planned. Dawn was still hours away, but sleep was impossible. Wade sat by his window, cleaning and checking his weapons with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through countless violent encounters. His Colt .45 Peacemaker bore the scratches and worn bluing of a working gun, while his backup piece, a short-barreled .38, nestled in a shoulder holster that would be invisible beneath his white suit jacket. A soft knock at his door interrupted the familiar ritual, and he opened it to find Sarah standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. She carried a wrapped bundle that she pressed into his hands with trembling fingers. "I've been sewing all night," she said quietly. "I wanted you to have this before you left." Wade unwrapped the bundle to reveal a black vest made from the finest wool, cut in the military style he'd favored during the war. The stitching was flawless, each seam reinforced with the skill that had made Sarah one of the finest seamstresses in 3 territories. But what caught his attention was the small silver thread. Embroidered over the heart, a raven in flight, its wings spread in defiance rather than retreat. "Sarah," he began, but she silenced him with a finger to his lips. "You told me once that you used to be someone different, someone you spent 15 years trying to forget," she said, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I've watched you these past weeks, and I've seen who you really are. You're not just the raven, you're a protector, a builder, a man who stands up for those who can't defend themselves. Wear this, and remember that you're fighting for something worth preserving." Wade pulled on the vest, feeling the weight of her faith in him settling around his shoulders like armor. The silver raven caught the lamplight, transforming from a symbol of death into something approaching hope. Ezra Thompson appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what the day would bring. "The boys are ready, boss. Miguel's got the horses saddled, and the twins have scouted 3 different routes to the old church. Bear's positioned himself where he can cover your back if things go sideways." Wade nodded, appreciating the military precision his old soldiers had brought to the morning's preparations. They'd fought together through hell during the war, and their loyalty had never wavered through 15 years of peace. If today brought violence, he couldn't ask for better men to stand beside him. "What about the townspeople?" Wade asked, knowing that Thorne's men might retaliate against civilians if the confrontation went badly. "Martha's got the women and children gathered at the church basement," Ezra replied. "Tom Brennan and the other shopkeepers are armed and ready to defend their businesses. Doc Henderson's got his medical supplies ready at 3 different locations in case the fighting spreads." As the sun began to paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Wade made his final preparations. The silver pocket watch that had guided him through 15 years of peaceful living went into the vest pocket Sarah had sewn, its familiar weight a reminder of his father's moral guidance. The black shooting glove transformed his gun hand into an instrument of precise violence, while the embroidered vest served as armor for his soul. Sarah walked with him to the livery stable, where his men waited with quiet professionalism. They'd all put on their old cavalry uniforms, faded blue wool that had seen action from Shiloh to Atlanta, brass buttons polished to a shine despite their age. These weren't just ranch hands anymore. They were soldiers preparing for one final campaign. "You don't have to do this alone," Miguel said, checking his rifle one more time. "We could surround the church, make sure Thorne doesn't have any surprises waiting." Wade appreciated the offer, but this was bigger than tactics and firepower. This needs to end with Edgar Thorne understanding that his kind of corruption won't be tolerated here. If I bring an army to face him, he'll just see it as another business problem to be solved, with more money and more guns. But if I walk in alone and walk out victorious, every other railroad baron and land grabber will think twice before trying the same tactics. Bear Morrison, the gentle giant who shared a surname with their enemy, spoke up with characteristic directness. "What if he just shoots you the moment you walk through that door?" Wade's smile held the cold confidence that had once made him a legend. "Then you boys make sure he regrets it. But Edgar Thorne isn't a killer. He's a businessman who hires other people to do his killing. He'll want to talk first. Try to find an angle that lets him win without risking his own neck." As Wade mounted his horse, Sarah approached for a final goodbye. The morning light caught the gold of her wedding ring chain, transforming it into a symbol of the future that might exist beyond the next few hours. "Promise me you'll come back," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I promise," Wade replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "But if something happens to me, I want you to take that forged deed to the territorial marshal in Denver. Make sure the whole world knows what Edgar Thorne was willing to do to steal your family's land." The ride to the old church took Wade through the heart of the valley that had become his home. Rolling grassland stretched toward distant mountains, dotted with cattle that bore his Circle S brand. This was what he'd built during 15 years of peace, not just a ranch, but a vision of what the frontier could become when good men worked together toward common goals. The church itself sat on a hill overlooking the valley, its weathered wooden walls and simple bell tower standing as monuments to the faith of early settlers who'd believed that civilization could take root even in the wildest places. Wade had helped raise the money to build it, and he'd attended services there every Sunday since arriving in the territory. Now it would serve as the setting for a confrontation that had been building since his partnership with Edgar Thorne had ended in violence 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. A church dedicated to redemption and forgiveness hosting a meeting between Two men whose relationship could only end in blood. Wade checked his father's pocket watch one final time, 9:45 in the morning. In 15 minutes, he would face the man whose greed had set in motion the chain of events that had transformed him from a peaceful rancher back into the deadly gunfighter known as the Raven. But this time was different. This time he wasn't fighting for money or reputation or the simple thrill of proving himself faster than another man. This time he was fighting for Sarah's right to live without fear, for the decent people of Dry Creek to build their lives in peace, and for the principle that evil shouldn't be allowed to triumph simply because it was willing to use violence. The black shooting glove flexed as Wade dismounted and approached the church doors. Time had indeed revealed all truth, and the truth was that some battles couldn't be avoided, only won or lost. Edgar Thorne was about to learn that 15 years of peaceful living hadn't softened Wade Sinclair. It had given him something worth fighting for that was stronger than mere survival. The reckoning had finally come, and Wade was ready to finish what Edgar Thorne had started in Colorado all those years ago. The real sheriff's badge lay on the altar of the old church, its silver surface tarnished with age, but bearing the authentic seal of the territorial government. Edgar Thorne had placed it there like a piece of evidence in a courtroom, proof of Sheriff Mill's corruption and the systematic breakdown of law and order that had made his land-grabbing scheme possible. Wade pushed through the church doors to find Thorne waiting in the front pew, his expensive suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. At 58, Edgar Thorne had grown soft around the middle, his once sharp features now bloated with prosperity and self-indulgence. But his pale blue eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made him one of the most successful railroad barons in the territory. Jake Morrison and two of his men flanked the altar, their hands resting casually on their gun belts, but their postures alert for trouble. The other members of Morrison's crew were positioned outside, creating a perimeter that would prevent escape while maintaining the illusion of a peaceful meeting. "Wade Sinclair," Thorne said, rising from his seat with theatrical politeness. "You look well for a man who's supposed to be dead. I heard you'd given up gunfighting to become a cattle rancher. How wonderfully domestic." Wade walked down the center aisle with measured steps, his black shooting glove visible against the white of his suit jacket. The silver raven that Sarah had embroidered over his heart caught the morning light streaming through the church's simple windows. "Edgar," Wade replied, his voice carrying the same casual tone he might use to greet an old acquaintance. "Still stealing from honest folks, I see. Some things never change." Thorne's laugh echoed off the wooden walls, but there was an edge of nervousness in it that hadn't been there 15 years ago. Stealing is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as aggressive acquisition of undervalued assets. The railroad needs a clear path through this valley, and Miss Collins' property happens to sit directly in that path. "So you decided to terrorize her into selling," Wade said, stopping at the front row of pews, close enough to strike but far enough away to have room to maneuver if shooting started. "Just like you decided to have me killed when I threatened to expose your operation in Colorado." The badge on the altar seemed to gleam with accusation, a symbol of the legitimate law that Thorne had corrupted for his own purposes. Wade recognized it as the badge that had belonged to Sheriff William Ross, an honest lawman who disappeared 6 months ago while investigating claims of railroad fraud. "Billy Torino was an unfortunate necessity," Thorne said with a casual shrug. "You were becoming inconveniently moral, and I couldn't afford to have a partner with sudden attacks of conscience. But you proved surprisingly difficult to kill, and after Tombstone, I decided it was more cost-effective to simply avoid territories where you might be operating." Morrison spoke up from his position near the altar, his pale eyes fixed on Wade with professional interest. "Boss, this is all very nostalgic, but maybe we should get to the point. My boys are getting anxious, and anxious men make mistakes." Thorne nodded, and pulled a leather portfolio from his jacket, extracting several documents that he laid out on the front pew like a hand of cards. "Here's what I'm prepared to offer, Wade. Miss Collins signs over her property for fair market value, let's say $2,000, and you take your men and ride out of the territory. Everyone walks away alive, and the railroad gets its right of way." Wade glanced at the papers, recognizing more forged documents designed to give Thorne's theft a veneer of legality. "And if I refuse? Then this valley becomes very unhealthy for people who oppose progress," Morrison said, his hand drifting closer to his gun. "Starting with that pretty little seamstress who's been causing so much trouble." The threat against Sarah crystallized. Wade's resolve like steel cooling in a forge. This wasn't just about land fraud anymore. It was about the fundamental question of whether evil men could terrorize innocent people with impunity. "You know what the problem with men like you is, Edgar," Wade said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded troops under fire. "You think everyone has a price, that every principle can be bought or intimidated away. You never learned to recognize the kind of man who can't be purchased or scared off." Thorne's confidence began to waver as he recognized something dangerous in Wade's tone. "Now see here, Wade, there's no need for anyone to get hurt. This is just business." "No," Wade replied, his steel-gray eyes never leaving Thorne's face. "This is justice. You've had 15 years to learn from what happened in Colorado, 15 years to become a better servant, man. Instead, you've gotten worse, terrorizing young women, corrupting lawmen, stealing from families who have nothing left but the land their parents died to claim." Morrison's hand was now openly resting on his gun butt, and Wade could sense the other two men shifting into combat positions. The peaceful negotiation was about to become something much more violent. "Last chance, Edgar," Wade said, his black shooting glove flexing as he prepared for the draw that would end this confrontation one way or another. "Call off your dogs, return the stolen land, and get out of the territory. Make the right choice for once in your miserable life." Thorne's face twisted with rage and greed, and Wade saw the exact moment when the railroad baron chose violence over justice. It was the same choice Thorne had made 15 years ago, and Wade was ready to deliver the same consequences. Edgar Thorne's silver spurs lay broken on the church floor, their ornate metalwork shattered by the impact of his fall. The expensive spurs had been a symbol of his wealth and power, crafted by the finest silversmiths in Denver and worn as badges of his dominance over lesser men. Now they were nothing but twisted metal, as broken as the man who'd worn them. The gunfight had lasted less than 30 seconds, but those seconds contained 15 years of accumulated justice. Morrison had drawn first, his pale eyes reflecting deadly confidence as his hand swept toward his gun. But Wade's black shooting glove moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman, his Colt, .45 clearing leather and firing in one smooth motion that seemed to bend time itself. Morrison's shot went wide, splintering wood from a pew as Wade's bullet took him center mass, the impact spinning the outlaw leader around before dropping him to the wooden floor. The two flanking gunmen had barely begun their draws when Wade's second and third shots found their marks with mathematical precision. Thorne had tried to run, his soft businessman's reflexes no match for the violence he'd unleashed. The fourth shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling over the altar rail in a tangle of expensive fabric and broken dreams. The silver spurs caught on the communion table, their bands snapping under the railroad baron's weight. Now, as gun smoke drifted through shafts of morning sunlight, Wade stood over the man who'd haunted his conscience for 15 years. Thorne lay clutching his wounded leg, his face pale with shock and the dawning realization that his money and connections couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. "You should have stayed in Colorado," Wade said, his voice carrying no satisfaction, only the weary acceptance of necessary violence. "You should have learned that some debts eventually come due." Thorne's breathing came in ragged gasps as he tried to staunch the bleeding from his leg wound. "You can't kill me, Wade. I'm not some outlaw you can. Gun down in the street. I have connections, powerful friends who'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." Wade holstered his gun and knelt beside Thorne, his steel-grey eyes reflecting neither mercy nor cruelty, only justice finally served. "I'm not going to kill you, Edgar. That would be too easy. And it wouldn't serve the cause of justice. You're going to live long enough to face a federal judge and answer for every crime you've committed." The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Wade's men, who'd heard the gunfire and come running despite his orders to stay away. Ezra Thompson was the first through the church doors, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation. "Boss, you all right?" Ezra asked, his rifle ready in case more of Morrison's crew were hiding nearby. "I'm fine," Wade replied, standing slowly and checking his father's pocket watch. The inscription, "Time reveals all truth," seemed particularly appropriate as he looked down at the broken spurs and the fallen railroad baron. Time to clean up this mess and restore some order to Dry Creek. Miguel Santos and the Patterson twins secured the area, while Bear Morrison, the gentle giant who shared a name with the dead outlaw, helped gather the evidence that would ensure Thorne faced federal prosecution. The forged land deeds, the real sheriff's badge, and Morrison's confession before the shooting began would provide more than enough proof of the conspiracy. As they prepared to transport Thorne back to town for medical treatment and eventual trial, Sarah Collins appeared in the church doorway. She disobeyed Wade's instructions to stay safe, but her presence felt right somehow, the victim witnessing justice finally served. "Is it over?" she asked, her blue eyes taking in the broken spurs and the scattered documents that represented Thorne's shattered scheme. Wade nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that had been there since his partnership with Thorne had ended in violence 15 years ago. "It's over. Thorne will face trial for fraud and conspiracy, and the territorial government will investigate every land deal he's made in the past decade." Sarah approached the altar where the real sheriff's badge still lay, its tarnished surface catching the morning light. "What about Sheriff Mills and the rest of his corrupt deputies?" "They'll face justice too," Wade assured her. "The territorial marshal is already en route with federal warrants. By sunset tonight, Dry Creek will have honest law enforcement again." As they helped the wounded Thorne to his feet, the railroad baron made one final attempt at negotiation. "Wade, be reasonable. I can make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. The railroad needs partners, not enemies." Wade's response was to hand Thorne over to Ezra Thompson and walk away without a backward glance. Some men never learned that there were things more valuable than money. Things like justice, honor, and the right of decent people to live their lives in peace. The silver spurs remained broken on the church floor, a fitting monument to the defeat of corrupt power and the triumph of righteousness over greed. The reckoning that had been 15 years in the making was finally complete, and Wade Sinclair could face the future with a clear conscience. The new town charter for Dry Creek bore the official seal of the territorial government and the signatures of elected representatives who would ensure that corruption never again took root in the valley. Sarah Collins had been elected as the town's first mayor, her courage during the crisis earning the respect and trust of citizens who'd learned that true leadership came from moral strength rather than political connections. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the old church, and the transformation of Dry Creek was nothing short of remarkable. Where once fear had stalked the dusty streets, families now walked hand in hand to the new schoolhouse that Wade had helped build. Where corruption had flourished in shadows, honest merchants conducted business under the protection of federal marshals who'd established a permanent presence in the territory. Wade stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house, watching the sun set over the valley that had become truly peaceful for the first time in years. The barn that Morrison's crew had burned was now larger and stronger than before, filled with cattle that bore his Circle S brand and horses that his men trained for buyers from California to Kansas. Sarah approached through the golden evening light, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the simple blue dress that had become her signature as mayor. The gold wedding ring that had once belonged to her mother now rested on her finger, placed there 3 months ago in a ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher in the same church where Wade had faced down Edgar Thorne. "The territorial marshal brought news from Denver," she said, settling into the chair beside. Her husband with the easy grace of a woman comfortable in her own strength. Edgar Thorne was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The judge said it was the harshest sentence he'd ever handed down for railroad fraud. Wade accepted the coffee gratefully, his black shooting glove now, retired to a drawer where it served as a reminder of skills he hoped never to use again. His hands bore the calluses of honest work rope, burns from cattle drives and tool marks from building fences that would stand for generations. "What about his railroad connections?" Wade asked, knowing that Thorne's arrest had sent shockwaves through the corrupt network of businessmen who'd profited from stolen land. 3 other railroad executives have been indicted, and the federal government is reviewing every land deal made in the past 5 years. Sarah replied with satisfaction. The decision to capture Thorne alive, rather than kill him, turned out to be the key to unraveling the whole conspiracy. The new town charter represented more than legal documents and elected officials. It embodied the principle that decent people could build lasting institutions when they had the courage to stand against evil. Dr. Henderson served as the town council's chairman, bringing his gentle wisdom to decisions about schools, churches, and civic improvements. Martha Sullivan had been elected sheriff, her no-nonsense approach to law enforcement earning respect from citizens and outlaws alike. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Wade reflected on the journey that had brought him from the legendary gunfighter known as the Raven to a married rancher helping to build a community. The silver pocket watch that had guided him through 15 years of peaceful living now marked time for a future filled with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. "I've been thinking about your father's inscription," Sarah said, her blue eyes catching the last rays of sunlight. "Time reveals all truth. Do you think he knew that you'd face a choice between vengeance and justice?" Wade considered the question carefully, remembering the gentle man who'd raised him to value building over destroying. "I think he knew that every man faces moments when his character is tested by circumstances beyond his control. The inscription wasn't about predicting the future, it was about having faith that good choices eventually lead to good outcomes." Their ranch hands were returning from the day's work, their voices carrying across the valley as they unsaddled horses and shared stories around the bunkhouse fire. Ezra Thompson had married Elena Martinez, the baker who'd been one of Morrison's early victims. Miguel Santos was courting Jenny Walsh, the young waitress who'd found her courage during the crisis. The Patterson twins had started their own horse ranch in partnership with Bear Morrison, whose gentle nature had made him a favorite with the children who rode his carefully trained ponies. Doc Henderson approached the house, carrying his ever-present medical bag and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd spent his day bringing new life into the world rather than patching up violence. "Baby Collins is doing fine," he announced, with a grin. Tom Brennan's wife delivered a healthy boy this afternoon, and they're naming him Wade in honor of the man who made their peaceful life possible. Sarah squeezed her husband's hand, feeling the strength that had once made him the most feared gunfighter in 3 territories now, dedicated to protecting and nurturing rather than destroying. The torn blue ribbon from her assault had been preserved in a frame on their mantel, not as a reminder of trauma, but as a symbol of how courage could transform suffering into strength. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Wade pulled out his father's pocket watch one final time. The inscription, "Time reveals all truth," had guided him through the darkest chapters of his life and brought him to this moment of perfect peace. The truth it revealed was simple but profound, that a man's past didn't have to define his future, that redemption was always possible for those willing to fight for it, and that love could heal even the deepest wounds. The new town charter rustled in the evening breeze, its legal language representing dreams that had become reality through courage, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that good would ultimately triumph over evil. Dry Creek was no longer a place where decent people lived in fear. It was a community where children could grow up believing in justice, where families could build futures based on honest work, and where the rule of law meant protection for the docile, innocent, rather than profit for the corrupt. Time had indeed revealed all truth, and the truth was beautiful.